In this video, we're going to talk about arguments. In fact, we'll do a number of things. First, we'll define what an argument is. Then we'll look at various parts of an argument. We'll look at two types of arguments themselves, how we can categorize them, and two ways to evaluate arguments. Well, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so what are arguments? Well, arguments are a series of statements which presents a consideration for accepting a claim. They're bits of reasoning in language, or in other words, assertions which attempt to justify a thesis. So you're trying to give support for a particular claim. And as such, arguments have various parts to them. But one thing we want to note before we get to that is that, sure, you use the term arguments in different ways in everyday language. You might say, hey, I've had an argument with my significant other or my family member or my roommate, and you might not have actually been giving a series of statements to justify the claim. Maybe you're just shouting at each other. Well, sure, the term arguments can be used in different ways, but in logic and in philosophy and in academia in general, usually this is what we mean by the term argument. So what are the parts of an argument? Well, you need to have at least one premise and you need to have a conclusion. And what does that mean? Well, a premise, this is the part that offers a reason to accept the claim, and you can have many of them if you'd like. They're the evidence or support behind whatever claim you're trying to make. There are premise indicators, such as because, as, for, since, given that, for the reason that, but these are just indicators because language is messy, and we can use these same type of indicators to mean different things, including causation statements or explanations, but nonetheless, they're nice indicators in language that can tell us, all right, this could be a premise to an argument. Now, what is a conclusion? Well, conclusion is just what the premises are trying to support. There are also a number of conclusion indicators, including but not limited to words like therefore, thus, hence, consequently, it follows that. Or if you want to be very formal, you can use the term ergo. Or if you want to be the most formal, you can not use words at all and instead use this 3-dot symbol here, which also means therefore in mathematics and symbolic logic. So back to this diagram here, you need to have at least one premise, but you also can have any number of premises. In fact, you can have an entire book or a set of books, all giving different premises for a single conclusion. But you do need to have a conclusion though, and you need to have, once again, at least one premise for it to be an argument. You can also have extended or complex arguments which contain other arguments in support of their premises. And then you could then also have other arguments in support of those premises, and then other arguments in support of those premises. But at the very least, if it's an argument, you need to have at least one premise and a conclusion. So let's look at a sample argument here. This is a classic example argument that's been in logic books for hundreds of years. I don't know what the original source for this particular sample argument is. If you happen to know, let me know in the comments. It's been around for a while. So the simple argument here is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Well, who's Socrates? Well, that's a story for another video. But let's break down the components of this argument. We have premises, all men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Backing up a conclusion, Socrates is mortal. We'll come back and evaluate this argument in a little bit, but for the moment, we just want to see how we can separate the premises from the conclusion. And a lot of times it makes it easier to evaluate or understand or study an argument if you can outline it in this way. Another thing we can look at here is another sample argument. Socrates is mortal, given that all men are mortal and Socrates is a man. Well, here, it's in fact the exact same argument, right? It's all given in one single sentence and it's in a different order, but nonetheless, we have the same conclusion and the same premises all packed in one. So an important note is that the conclusion in language, we can state the conclusion at any point in the argument, beginning, middle, or end. Sometimes it's restated multiple times throughout an argument, especially if it's a longer one. And very often it's good writing style to state what you're going to argue for first, your conclusion first. And here's my conclusion. And give a summary of how you're going to back it up before you go more in detail into the premises. So yeah, in language, it's not always nice and neat premises followed by conclusion. It can be all over the place. So now let's look at two types of arguments. We have deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Deductive arguments are arguments of necessity. Inductive arguments are arguments of probability. It's important to know the difference because if you study logic further, you'll see that there's different ways that you evaluate an argument depending on what type of argument it is. So let's first go over deductive arguments. Deductive arguments are arguments in which the premises are intended to provide complete support for the conclusion. It's supposed to prove the conclusion. They aren't always successful, but that's at least the intent here for these types of arguments. So once again, arguments of necessity. Deductive arguments, when you assess the reasoning, they're either valid or invalid. It's binary in that sense. A valid argument is one that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. It has to follow. In other words, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Whereas inductive arguments, for inductive arguments, the premises are intended to provide some degree of support, but less than complete support for the conclusion. They're arguments of probability once again. A good, strong argument that's inductive in nature will make the conclusion likely, but there's always some room for it not to be the case. So as such, inductive arguments can be relatively strong and weak. So it could be strong in the sense that, well, it makes it a little bit likely, maybe 51%. It could be very strong and maybe 99.9% likely, but still not a certainty. So here we have a spectrum of relatively weak versus relatively strong instead of just valid or invalid. So I made this diagram here to go over the basic nature of what makes a good argument. So in general, a good argument needs two things. It needs to have true premises, and it also needs to have good reasoning. We use a little bit different language to describe these things depending on what type of argument it is. So for a deductive arguments, those arguments of necessity, you still need to have true premises, but the type of reasoning we're concerned with is whether it has valid reasoning. And if it does have valid reasoning and true premises, we call it a sound argument. For inductive arguments, still need to have those true premises, but in terms of evaluating the reasoning, we ask whether it has strong reasoning. And if a inductive argument is a good argument that has true premises and sound reasoning, in this case, we call it a cogent argument. Of course, not all arguments are good arguments. And so how do you evaluate arguments? Well, you assess one of these components here, or both. Now, note that when we are assessing whether an argument is a good argument, we don't just look at the conclusion and ask whether we agree with it. Instead, we're asking, does it have true premises? Does it have good reasoning? So let's look at both of those ways here for a moment. So we can assess the premises, we can assess the reasoning. When we assess the premises, we're simply asking whether those premises are true, or if they're problematic or uncertain. If there's any doubt to them, that doubt is cast on the argument as a whole. We can also assess the reasoning. And when we assess the reasoning, we assess whether the conclusion necessarily follows for deductive arguments or likely follows for those inductive arguments from the supporting statements. So another way that you can think of this is that we're asking, do the premises adequately support the conclusion? Why or why not? Now, what counts as adequate support? It might look a little different depending on what type of reasoning you're using, inductive or deductive, but nonetheless, we're still asking the same question. Do they adequately support the conclusion? So let's go back to the sample argument and evaluate it real quickly. So the two main methods for evaluating an argument, assess the premises, and then also assess the reasoning. Let's look at the premises first. Well, all men are mortal. Well, that seems to check out. Socrates is a man. Well, we might want to change it to was a man, talking about historically speaking, but still seems to check out there. So the premises seem fine. So then the next thing we need to assess is the reasoning. If the premises are true, and we, for the most part, are agreeing with those premises, then asking whether the conclusion follows. And it turns out it does. This has good, valid reasoning. Now, there are different systems where we could prove this. We could use categorical logic. We could use versions of predicate logic to actually definitively prove that this has a valid logic. But for simple arguments like this, many people can intuitively look at it and say, well, yeah, if the premises are true here, then the conclusion does, in fact, follow. All right, let's look at another sample argument. So in this argument, we have two premises as well, followed by a conclusion. In this case, we have all men are mortal. Hypatia is a woman. Therefore, Hypatia is immortal. All right, checks out, right? Well, let's take a look. Let's assess the premises and the reasoning. Well, all men are indeed mortal. Hypatia was a woman. So, all right, so far so good. But what about the reasoning? Well, it turns out the reasoning is flawed. Just because all men are mortal and Hypatia is a woman, it doesn't follow that Hypatia is immortal, of course. We could go and explain why this reasoning doesn't work. We could even use formal methods to demonstrate why this doesn't work. But for now, it's sufficient to say, look, premises are good, the reasoning is flawed, so as such, it's an invalid argument. It's a bad argument. All right, well, that's all for this video. I hope this gave you a good introduction to what arguments are and how to assess them. If you found this video helpful, please consider helping the channel out by liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing. And of course, if you're on YouTube, you can also hit that bell for notifications for future videos. Hey, you made it to the post-credit scene. Here I just give a few extra thoughts on some of the content that we covered in the rest of the video. So first, in terms of deductive versus inductive logic, one thing I wanted to mention here is that there are some people that want to include other types of reasoning in terms of major types of arguments as well, such as abductive reasoning. From my point of view, though, we're still going to ultimately categorize these things as either deductive arguments of necessity or inductive in some way dealing with probability here. Now, you can maybe say for certain types of arguments, we're not exactly looking for the most likely candidate, but perhaps just the one that makes the most sense or is coherent. But nonetheless, we're still dealing, I think, with arguments that give partial support versus full support. So I still think separating them into deductive versus inductive is the best way to initially categorize them. Although that being said, there are many different forms of deductive arguments and there are many different forms of inductive arguments to be studied and to assess. Next, in terms of ways to evaluate arguments, here obviously this is still an oversimplification. There's one classic way that you assess arguments that doesn't deal with the premises or the reasoning, but instead just the conclusion, called argumentum ad absurdum, which attempts to show that an argument is faulty, it's a bad argument based upon the conclusion alone by showing that the conclusion leads to an absurd outcome. So if you can demonstrate that a conclusion leads to some absurdity or some falsehood, you can be certain that, well, there's something wrong with the argument somewhere. Now, this doesn't actually tell us exactly what's wrong with the argument. It doesn't tell us what premise is false or how the reasoning is flawed. It just tells us there has to be something wrong somewhere in that argument since the conclusion leads to some absurdity. So even if you use that type of assessment, it's still best to go back to the argument and try to find the flaw. Because sometimes things look like they're absurd or lead to contradictions, but when we study them further, maybe it's not quite as absurd as it seemed, or perhaps there isn't an actual contradiction there, even though it seemed so at first. One thing we'll note here is that in terms of historically speaking, there is some debate, not very much, but there is some debate of whether Socrates ever actually existed, or whether he was a figment of a couple writers' imagination, such as Plato and Xenophon. But for the most part, historians agree that yes, a character named Socrates did exist. He was a philosopher. The exact details of who that guy was might be up for debate, but for the most part, people do agree that Socrates was a man at one point. So, you know, there is at least some debate over this premise here. Not so much over this one, but hey, maybe some philosophers can let us know in the chat some debate over this premise too. If you had any thoughts about anything we talked about in this video, beginning, middle, or end, please let me know in the comments. And if you have any ideas for future videos, let me know there as well. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.